Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read a lightly edited version of The Blazing World by Margaret Cavendish from 1666, considered to be the first science fiction book written by a woman. It's a fascinating glimpse into the ideas of science and philosophy at that time. The book will be read in order, so if you would like to begin at the beginning, please start with Season 5, Episode 87. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Blue Sky, Instagram, or Facebook at Exploration Dreamland. If you have a moment to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, it helps more than you know. You can also hear our episodes on YouTube. If you are listening there, please like our episodes and leave a comment for us. We love hearing from you. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. After this, and several other conferences, which the Empress held with the worm men, she dismissed them, and having taken much satisfaction in several of their answers, encouraged them in their studies and observations. Then she made a convocation of her chemists, the ape-men, and commanded them to give her an account of the several transmutations which their art was able to produce. They began first with a long and tedious discourse concerning the primitive ingredients of natural bodies, and how, by their art, they had found out the principles out of which they consist. But they did not all agree in their opinions, for some said that the principles of all natural bodies were the four elements, fire, air, water, earth, out of which they were composed. Others rejected this elementary commixture and said there were many bodies out of which none of the four elements could be extracted by any degree of fire whatsoever, and that, on the other side, there were diverse bodies whose resolution by fire reduced them into more than four different ingredients. And these affirmed that the only principles of natural bodies were salt, sulfur, and mercury. Others again declared that none of the aforementioned could be called the true principles of natural bodies, but that by their industry and pains which they had taken in the art of chemistry, they had discovered that all natural bodies were produced but from one principle, which was water. For all vegetables, minerals, and animals, said they, are nothing else but simple water distinguished into various figures by the virtue of their seeds. But after a great many debates and contentions about this subject, the Empress being so much tired that she was not able to hear them any longer, imposed a general silence upon them, and then declared herself in this following discourse. I am too sensible of the pains you have taken in the art of chemistry to discover the principles of natural bodies, and wish they had been more profitably bestowed upon some other than such experiments. For both by my own contemplation and the observations which I have made by my rational and sensitive perception upon nature and her works, I find that nature is but one infinite self-moving body, which by the virtue of its self-motion is divided into infinite parts, which parts being restless undergo perpetual changes and transmutations by their infinite compositions and divisions. Now, if this be so, as surely according to regular sense and reason it appears no otherwise, it is vain to look for primary ingredients or constitutive principles of natural bodies, since there is no more but one universal principle of nature, to wit, self-moving matter, which is the only cause of all natural effects. Next, I desire you to consider that fire is but a particular creature or effect of nature, and occasions not only different effects in several bodies, but on some bodies has no power at all. Witness gold, which never could be brought yet to change its interior figure by the art of fire. And if this be so, why should you be so simple as to believe that fire can show you the principles of nature, and that either the four elements, or water only, or salt, sulphur, and mercury, all which are no more but particular effects and creatures of nature, should be the primitive ingredients or principles of all natural bodies? Wherefore I will not have you to take more pains and waste your time in such fruitless attempts, but be wiser hereafter, and busy yourselves with such experiments as may be beneficial to the public. The Empress, having thus declared her mind to the ape-men, and given them better instructions than perhaps they expected, not knowing that Her Majesty had such great and able judgment in natural philosophy, had several conferences with them concerning chemical preparations, which for brevity's sake I'll forbear to rehearse. Amongst the rest, she asked how it came that the imperial race appeared so young and yet was reported to have lived so long, some of them 2, some 3, and some 400 years, and whether it was by nature or a special divine blessing. To which they answered that there was a certain rock in the parts of that world which contained the golden sands, which rock was hollow within, and did produce a gum that was 100 years before it came to its full strength and perfection. This gum, said they, if it be held in a warm hand, will dissolve into an oil, the effects whereof are following. It being given every day for some certain time to an old decayed man in the bigness of a little pea, will first make him spit for a week or more. After this, it will cause vomits of phlegm, and after that it will bring forth by vomits humours of several colours, first of a pale yellow, then of a deep yellow, then of a green, and lastly a black colour. And each of these humours have a several taste. Some are fresh, some salt, some sour, some bitter, and so forth. Neither do all these vomits make them sick, but they come out on a sudden and unawares, without any pain or trouble to the patient. And after it hath done all these mentioned effects, and cleared both the stomach and several other parts of the body, then it works upon the brain, and brings forth of the nose such kinds of humours as it did out of the mouth, and much after the same manner. Then it will purge by stool, then by urine, then by sweat, and lastly by bleeding at the nose and the hemorrhoids. all which effects it will perform within the space of 6 weeks, or a little more. For it does not work very strongly, but gently and by degrees. Lastly, when it has done all this, it will make the body break out into a thick scab, and cause both hair, teeth, and nails to come off, which scab being arrived to its full maturity, opens first along the back, and comes off all in a piece like armor, and all this is done within the space of 4 months. After this, the patient is wrapped into a cerecloth, prepared of certain gums and juices, wherein he continues until the time of 9 months be expired from the first beginning of the cure, which is the time of a child's formation in the womb. In the meanwhile, his diet is nothing else but eagle's eggs and hind's milk, and after the cerecloth is taken away, he will appear of the age of 20, both in shape and strength. The weaker sort of this gum is sovereign in healing of wounds and curing of slight distempers. But this is also to be observed, that none of the imperial race does use any other drink but lime water, or water in which limestone is immerged. Their meat is nothing else but fowl of several sorts. Their recreations are many, but chiefly hunting. This relation amazed the Empress very much, for though in the world she came from, she had heard great reports of the philosopher's stone, yet had she not heard of any that had ever found it out, which made her believe it was but a chimera. She called also to mind that there had been in the same world a man who had a little stone which cured all kinds of diseases, outward and inward, according it was applied, and that a famous chemist had found out a certain liquor called alkahest, which by the virtue of its own fire consumed all diseases. But she had never heard of a medicine that could renew old age and render it beautiful, vigorous, and strong. Nor would she have so easily believed it, had it been a medicine prepared by art. For she knew that art, being nature's changeling, was not able to produce such a powerful effect. But being that the gum did grow naturally, she did not so much scruple at it, for she knew that nature's works are so various and wonderful that no particular creature is able to trace her ways. The conferences of the chemists being finished, the Empress made an assembly of her Galenical physicians, her herbalists and anatomists. And first she enquired of her herbalists the particular effects of several herbs and drugs, and whence they proceeded. To which they answered that they could, for the most part, tell her Majesty the virtues and operations of them, but the particular causes of their effects were unknown. Only this much they could say, that their operations and virtues were generally caused by their proper inherent, corporeal, figurative motions, which being infinitely various in infinite nature, did produce infinite several effects. And it is observed, said they, that herbs and drugs are as wise in their operations as men in their words and actions, nay, wiser. And their effects are more certain than men in their opinions. For though they cannot discourse like men, yet have they sense and reason as well as men. For the discursive faculty is but a particular effect of sense and reason in some particular creatures, to wit, men, and not a principle of nature, and argues often more folly than wisdom. The Empress asked whether they could not by a composition and commixture of other drugs make them work other effects than they did used by themselves. They answered that they could make them produce artificial effects, but not alter their inherent, proper, and particular natures. Then the Empress commanded her anatomists to dissect such kinds of creatures as are called monsters. But they answered Her Majesty that it would be but an unprofitable and useless work, and hinder their better employments. For when we dissect dead animals, said they, it is for no other end but to observe what defects and distempers they had, that we may cure the like in living ones, so that all our care and industry concerns only the preservation of mankind. But we hope your Majesty will not preserve monsters, which are most commonly destroyed, except it be for novelty. Neither will the dissection of monsters prevent the errors of nature's irregular actions, for by dissecting some, we cannot prevent the production of others, so that our pains and labor will be to no purpose, unless to satisfy the vain curiosities of inquisitive men. The Empress replied that such dissections would be very beneficial to experimental philosophers. If experimental philosophers, answered they, do spend their time in such useless inspections, they waste it in vain, and have nothing but their labor for their pains. Lastly, Her Majesty had some conferences with the Galenic physicians about several diseases, and amongst the rest desired to know the cause and nature of apoplexies and the spotted plague. They answered that a deadly apoplexy was a dead palsy of the brain, and the spotted plague was a gangrene of the vital parts. And as the gangrene of outward parts did strike inwardly, so the gangrene of inward parts did break forth outwardly. Which is the cause, said they, that as soon as the spots appear, death follows, for then it is an infallible sign that the body is throughout infected with a gangrene which is a spreading evil. But some gangrenes do spread more suddenly than others, and of all sorts of gangrenes the plaguey gangrene is the most infectious, for other gangrenes infect but the next adjoining parts of one particular body, and having killed that same creature go no further, but cease. Whenas the gangrene of the plague infects not only the adjoining parts of one particular creature, but also those that are distant. That is, one particular body infects another, and so breeds a universal contagion. But the Empress, being very desirous to know in what manner the plague was propagated and became so contagious, asked whether it went actually out of one body into another. To which they answered that it was a great dispute amongst the learned of their profession, whether it came by a division and composition of parts, that is, by expiration and inspiration, or whether it was caused by imitation. Some experimental philosophers, said they, will make us believe that by the help of their microscopes they have observed the plague to be a body of little flies like atoms, which go out of one body into another through the sensitive passages. But the most experienced and wisest of our society have rejected this opinion as a ridiculous fancy, and do, for the most part, believe that it is caused by an imitation of parts, so that the motions of some parts which are sound do imitate the motions of those that are infected, and that by this means the plague becomes contagious and spreading. The Empress, having hitherto spent her time in the examination of the bird, fish, worm, and ape-men, etc., and received several intelligences from their several employments, at last had a mind to divert herself after her serious discourses, and therefore she sent for the spider-men, which were her mathematicians, the lice-men, which were her geometricians, and the magpie, parrot, and jackdaw men, which were her orators and logicians. The spider-men came first, and presented her Majesty with a table full of mathematical points, lines, and figures of all sorts, of squares, circles, triangles, and the like, which the Empress, notwithstanding that she had a very ready wit and quick apprehension, could not understand. But the more she endeavoured to learn, the more was she confounded. Whether they did ever square the circle, I cannot exactly tell, nor whether they could make imaginary points and lines. But this I dare say, that their points and lines were so slender, small, and thin that they seemed next to imaginary. The mathematicians were in great esteem with the Empress as being not only the chief tutors and instructors in many arts, but some of them excellent magicians and informers of spirits, which was the reason their characters were so abstruse and intricate that the Empress knew not what to make of them. "There is so much to learn in your art," said she, "that I can neither spare time from other affairs to busy myself in your profession, nor, if I could, do I think I should ever be able to understand your imaginary points, lines, and figures, because they are non-beings." Then came the lice-men, and endeavoured to measure all things to a hair's breadth, and weigh them to an atom. But their weights would seldom agree, especially in the weighing of air, which they found a task impossible to be done, at which the Empress began to be displeased, and told them that there was neither truth nor justice in their profession, and so dissolved their society. After this, the Empress was resolved to hear the magpie, parrot, and jackdaw men, which were her professed orators and logicians. Whereupon one of the parrot men rose with great formality and endeavoured to make an eloquent speech before her Majesty. But before he had half ended, his arguments and divisions being so many that they caused a great confusion in his brain, he could not go forward, but was forced to retire backward with great disgrace both to himself and the whole society. And although one of his brethren endeavoured to second him by another speech, yet was he as far to seek as the former. At which the Empress appeared not a little troubled, and told them that they followed too much the rules of art, and confounded themselves with too nice formalities and distinctions. "But since I know," said she, "that you are a people who have naturally voluble tongues and good memories, I desire you to consider more the subject you speak of than your artificial periods, connections, and parts of speech, and leave the rest to your natural eloquence." Which they did, and so became very eminent orators. Lastly, her Imperial Majesty, being desirous to know what progress her logicians had made in the art of disputing, commanded them to argue upon several themes or subjects, which they did, and having made a very nice discourse of logistical terms and propositions, entered into a dispute by way of syllogistical arguments through all the figures and modes. One began with an argument of the first mode of the first figure, thus: every politician is wise, every knave is a politician, therefore every knave is wise. Another contradicted him with a syllogism of the second mode of the same figure, thus: no politician is wise, every knave is a politician, therefore no knave is wise. The third made an argument in the third mode of the same figure after this manner: every politician is wise, some knaves are politicians, therefore some knaves are wise. The fourth concluded with a syllogism in the fourth mode of the same figure, thus: no politician is wise, some knaves are politicians, therefore some knaves are not wise. After this they took another subject, and one propounded this syllogism: every philosopher is wise, every beast is wise, therefore every beast is a philosopher. But another said that this argument was false, therefore he contradicted him with a syllogism of the second figure of the fourth mode, thus: every philosopher is wise, some beasts are not wise, therefore some beasts are not philosophers. Thus they argued and intended to go on, but the Empress interrupted them. I have enough, said she, of your chopped logic, and will hear no more of your syllogisms, for it disorders my reason and puts my brain on the rack. Your formal argumentations are able to spoil all natural wit, and I'll have you to consider what art does not make reason, but reason makes art, and therefore as much as reason is above art, so much is a natural, rational discourse to be preferred before an artificial. For art is, for the most part, irregular, and disorders men's understandings more than it rectifies them, and leads them into a labyrinth where they'll never get out, and makes them dull and unfit for useful employments. Especially your art of logic, which consists only in contradicting each other, in making sophisms and obscuring truth, instead of clearing it. But they replied to Her Majesty that the knowledge of nature, that is, natural philosophy, would be imperfect without the art of logic, and that there was an improbable truth which could not otherwise be found out than by the art of disputing. Truly, said the Empress, I do believe that it is with natural philosophy as it is with all other effects of nature. For no particular knowledge can be perfect. By reason, knowledge is dividable, as well as composable. Nay, to speak properly, nature herself cannot boast of any perfection but God himself, because there are so many irregular motions in nature, and 'tis but a folly to think that art should be able to regulate them, since art itself is, for the most part, irregular. But as for improbable truth, I know not what your meaning is, for truth is more than improbability. Nay, there is so much difference between truth and improbability that I cannot conceive it possible how they can be joined together. In short, said she, I do no ways approve of your profession. And though I will not dissolve your society, yet I shall never take delight in hearing you any more. Wherefore, confine your disputations to your schools, lest, besides the commonwealth of learning, they disturb also divinity and policy, religion and laws, and by that means draw an utter ruin and destruction both upon church and state. After the Empress had thus finished the discourses and conferences with the mentioned societies of her virtuosos, she considered by herself the manner of their religion, and finding it very defective, was troubled that so wise and knowing a people should have no more knowledge of the divine truth. Wherefore she consulted with her own thoughts whether it was possible to convert them all to her own religion, and to that end she resolved to build churches, and make also up a congregation of women, whereof she intended to be the head herself, and to instruct them in the several points of her religion. This she had no sooner begun, but the women, which generally had quick wits, subtle conceptions, clear understandings, and solid judgments, became in a short time very devout and zealous sisters, for the Empress had an excellent gift of preaching and instructing them in the articles of faith, and by that means she converted them not only soon, but gained an extraordinary love of all her subjects throughout that world. But at last, pondering with herself the inconstant nature of mankind, and fearing that in time they would grow weary and desert the divine truth, following their own fancies and living according to their own desires, she began to be troubled that her labors and pains should prove of so little effect, and therefore studied all manner of ways to prevent it. Amongst the rest, she called to mind a relation which the birdmen made her once, of a mountain that did burn in flames of fire, and thereupon did immediately send for the wisest and subtlest of her worm-men, commanding them to discover the cause of the eruption of that same fire, which they did, and having dived to the very bottom of the mountain, informed her Majesty that there was a certain sort of stone whose nature was such that, being wetted, it would grow excessively hot and break forth into a flaming fire until it became dry, and then it ceased from burning. The Empress was glad to hear this news, and forthwith desired the worm-men to bring her some of that stone, but be sure to keep it secret. She sent also for the birdmen, and asked them whether they could not get her a piece of the sunstone. They answered that it was impossible, unless they did spoil or lessen the light of the world. But, said they, if it please your Majesty, we can demolish one of the numerous stars of the sky, which the world will never miss. The Empress was very well satisfied with this proposal, and having thus employed these two sorts of men, in the meanwhile builded 2 chapels, one above another. The one she lined throughout with diamonds, both roof, walls, and pillars, but the other she resolved to line with the starstone. The firestone she placed upon the diamond lining, by reason fire has no power on diamonds, and when she would have that chapel where the firestone was appear all in flame, she had by the means of artificial pipes water conveyed into it, which by turning the cock did, as out of a fountain, spring over all the room, and as long as the firestone was wet, the chapel seemed to be all in a flaming fire. The other chapel, which was lined with the starstone, did only cast a splendrous and comfortable light. Both the chapels stood upon pillars, just in the middle of a round cloister, which was dark as night. Neither was there any other light within them, but what came from the fire and starstone, and being everywhere open, allowed to all that were within the compass of the cloister a free prospect into them. Besides, they were so artificially contrived that they did both move in a circle about their own centres, without intermission, contrary ways. In the chapel, which was lined with the firestone, the Empress preached sermons of terror to the wicked, and told them of the punishments for their sins, to wit, that after this life they should be tormented in an everlasting fire. But in the other chapel, lined with the starstone, she preached sermons of comfort to those that repented of their sins and were troubled at their own wickedness. Neither did the heat of the flame in the least hinder her, for the firestone did not cast so great a heat, but the Empress was able to endure it, by reason the water which was poured on the stone by its own self-motion turned into a flaming fire, occasioned by the natural motions of the stone, which made the flame weaker than if it had been fed by some other kind of fuel. The other chapel where the starstone was, although it did cast a great light, yet was it without all heat, and the Empress appeared like an angel in it. And as that chapel was an emblem of hell, so this was an emblem of heaven. And thus the Empress, by art and her own ingenuity, did not only convert the blazing world to her own religion, but kept them in a constant belief, without enforcement or bloodshed. For she knew well that belief was a thing not to be forced or pressed upon the people, but to be instilled into their minds by gentle persuasions. And after this manner she encouraged them also in all other duties and employments. For fear, though it makes people obey, yet does it not last so long, nor is it so sure a means to keep them to their duties, as love. Last of all, when she saw that both church and state now in a well-ordered and settled condition, her thoughts reflected upon the world she came from, and though she had a great desire to know the condition of the same, yet could she advise no manner of way how to gain any knowledge thereof. At last, after many serious considerations, she conceived that it was impossible to be done by any other means than by the help of immaterial spirits. Wherefore she made a convocation of the most learned, witty, and ingenious of all the aforementioned sorts of men, and desired to know of them whether there were any immaterial spirits in their world. First she enquired of the worm men whether they had perceived some within the earth. They answered her Majesty that they never knew of any such creatures, for whatsoever did dwell within the earth, said they, was embodied and material. Then she asked the fly-men whether they had observed any in the air, for you, having numerous eyes, said she, will be more able to perceive them than any other creatures. To which they answered her Majesty that although spirits, being immaterial, could not be perceived by the worm men in the earth, yet they perceived that such creatures did lodge in the vehicles of the air. Then the Empress asked whether they could speak to them, and whether they did understand each other. The fly-men answered that those spirits were always clothed in some sort or other of material garments, which garments were their bodies made, for the most part, of air. And when occasion served, they could put on any other sort of substances, but yet they could not put these substances into any form or shape as they pleased. The Empress asked the fly-men whether it was possible that she could be acquainted and have some conferences with them. They answered they did verily believe she might. Hereupon the Empress commanded the flymen to ask some of the spirits whether they would be pleased to give her a visit. This they did, and after the spirits had presented themselves to the Empress, in what shapes and forms I cannot exactly tell, after some few compliments that passed between them, the Empress told the spirits that she questioned not, but they did know how she was a stranger in that world, and by what miraculous means she was arrived there. And since she had a great desire to know the condition of the world she came from, her request to the spirits was to give her some information thereof, especially of those parts of the world where she was born, bred, and educated, as also of her particular friends and acquaintance, all which the spirits did according to her desire. Stay tuned for the next section of The Blazing World by the Duchess of Newcastle. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg and LibriVox for helping me find many interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.